Hello, my name is Ed Fuquay, young adult librarian extraordinaire here at Woonsocket Harris Public Library.
Solitaire Frisbee from the Children's Room.
We're here for another exciting episode of Conversations, and we're still deep in African mythology.
Okay.
Last time we talked about the Orishas, and today I want to talk about one of the most famous figures from African mythology. Many people have heard of him, and that's Anansi the spider. He's a trickster god. Do you know about Anansi?
I've heard, and I believe I've read a couple times, but literally decades
Yeah.
ago.
There are hundreds of Anansi stories. They're all over the internet. Storytellers continue to do them on a regular basis all over the world. He's one of the classic trickster gods. He figures in Neil Gaiman's American God series, and he's on the current TV series based on that. He also is the central figure of Anansi Boys by Neil Gaiman.
Is this, it's a young adult?
Yes, I have it in the young adult second. It's not technically young adult, but yeah, it deals with his children.
His children?
Yes. Technically, he's dead in the course of the book, although as a trickster god, you can well imagine he's not actually dead.
Okay.
Anansi is a spider god, and he's a trickster god. He is worshipped by the Ashanti people of Ghana, although there are Anansi stories from all over Africa. Trickster stories are always popular. Underdog heroes have tremendous appeal, particularly people who appear helpless but always wind up outwitting and outsmarting much more powerful enemies are very, very popular, especially if you are a disadvantaged person. The Anansi stories were brought over to the Americas because of slavery, where the stories were told and retold and altered several times. It has tremendous appeal that you can use your brains to outwit someone who's more powerful than you, which is one of the reasons why trickster stories have always been popular. When it comes to tricksters, though, Anansi is very much of that type. He has a lot of the negative stereotypes of the tricksters and not a lot of the positive ones. Tricksters usually do positive things for the world in the long run, even if it's accidentally. And Anansi rarely does anything except for himself. To get himself food or to make himself rich. He's tiny, of course, he's a spider. Now, in most of the stories, he's actually a person rather than a spider. So you can say he's a person and a spider, if you want.
Okay.
He is lazy, greedy.
So, wait a minute.
Yeah.
When you say both, do you mean like a shapeshifter?
In most of the stories, the fact that he's, quote, a spider isn't all that important.
Okay.
The stories could easily be told about any other animal or about two people.
Mm-hmm.
But he's still Anansi the spider.
Okay.
He's lazy, he's greedy, he lies all the time to everyone, treats everyone basically horribly, is incapable of feeling any guilt whatsoever for anything that he does, no matter how awful it is, and very rarely gets punished. He sometimes gets punished when he's caught, and some of the stories even end with him dying, but of course he's always back for the next story.
Punished by whom?
Various people. Sometimes things turn against him, sometimes a king will capture him, will be punished.
Even though he's a god?
Yeah. Well, he's a god, but there are a lot of stories where he's a farmer with a wife and a kid.
Oh.
So he's a trickster. It's nebulous. He both is and isn't several of these things simultaneously.
Is he just wanting to experience life as something other than...
You could say that.
Okay.
His motives are never really explained beyond the obvious. So before I tell any of his stories, I have to say thank you, Anansi, because these stories belong to Anansi, because all stories belong to Anansi. Every story is an Anansi story.
You mentioned that last time.
Yes, and there's a reason for that, because he owns all the stories in the world.
Is that the reason, or is there a reason for that?
Well, there's an actual story about how he gained all the stories, which is the most famous one of his adventures.
Should we start there?
Yes, we can start. It's a
Okay.
good place to start.
Okay.
That's where I decided to start. So, the creator god, this part of the world was named Nyambi. Nyambi created all things, and therefore owned all stories.
Okay.
And so, Anansi, because some people say he thought the world was too boring, it would be more exciting if there were like more stories in the world. He probably thought it'd be much more exciting if there were more stories about him in the world. Says no one had heard of him yet because, never know stories. So He went up to Nyambi and tried to talk him into giving him all the stories, and Nyambi didn't want to. So he set a series of tasks that were supposed to be, impossible, which again is a typical mythological motif that we'll see again and again. So what Anansi had to do to win the stories from Nyambi is he had to capture these impossibly violent and dangerous hornets from this nest of hornets, capture a gigantic python, and capture a leopard.
Are these the murder hornets?
Yeah, they're murder hornets. I'm pretty sure they were murder hornets. In most of the stories, these animals each have names and personalities, which I won't get into here.
And I feel like we just breezed over the facts. So he just, from the get-go, he was going after all the stories,
Yeah.
not some. Just
Yeah.
he was Napoleon. He wanted
Basically, he
everything.
wanted all the stories for himself. So the way he went about this was, in typical trickster fashion, he did everything the easy way. He went up to the nest of the murder hornets, and he basically, first he poured water all over himself, and then he poured water on the nest of hornets. And he had the empty gourd that had contained the water. So the hornets all came buzzing out, and he said, "It's a torrential downpour, you guys will drown completely. Here, hide in this gourd," which they all did. And he immediately sealed it up, and he captured the murder hornets. That was part one of the quest. So second one was a python. The python was gigantic. So Anansi went into the jungle and cut this big stick, and he throws it in the ground. Then he starts arguing with himself using two different voices. And he's so loud and obnoxious that Python sticks his head out and says, "What are you arguing about?" And Anansi says, "Well, my wife and I were discussing whether or not you were longer than this big stick." And so Python says, "Well, of course I'm longer than that stick." And he says, "Well, show me, stretch right out and show me." So of course Python lays himself down and stretches himself out. As soon as he does that, then Anansi grabs some rope he had hidden and ties him tightly to the stick and delivers him back to Nyambi. That's quest number 2 accomplished.
That was the end of the Titanoboa.
Yeah. So the next one is a vicious, animal-eating leopard. So to capture the leopard, he digs a pit and covers it up with branches and leaves and things like that. Now you may notice that all of these traps are really very simple. And because these things weren't a cliche yet, because there were no stories.
Right.
None of them had ever heard these stories, so they fell into these things immediately. Yes, leopard fell into the trap and was stuck at the bottom of the pit, and Nazi says, "Wait, I will pull you out. Here, grab a hold of my thread, my fine thread. You can climb up on that." So he starts weaving out some of his spider silk down there. And so the leopard started grabbing it and pulling himself up. But Anansi kept weaving out more and more of his silk and wrapping it around him tighter and tighter until by the time leopard got to the front, Anansi tugged on him and came up, tied up in a big bundle of webbing. That's how he succeeded. There's sometimes a fourth thing he has to get, which is sometimes a ghost, which he captures in a burlap bag, and it's sometimes an invisible fairy named Memotia.
That's in addition to the ghost?
Sometimes it's 4 things, sometimes it's 3 things. That's the nature of stories.
Okay.
Let's stick with the 3 animal versions now. That fits the motif of the day.
All right.
So he captured these 3 things, and sure enough, Nyambi gives him all the stories in the world. Which is why storytellers like me should begin every episode by thanking Anansi for letting me use his stories.
Okay.
That's very important. And that is also the story I've discovered so far in which Anansi works the hardest. For the most part, he goes out of his way not to do any hard work. For instance, one of the stories about him is this one, he has a wife and a son. So there's a drought and they need rain. And so the son is really upset and he runs into the king's magical dwarf, because the king of the countryside has a magical dwarf. And the dwarf realizes that they're going to die without crops. So he says, "Here, I tell you what, he grabs those twigs and tap them against my hunchback here, and that'll bring rain." And so the son does it, and indeed it does start to sprinkle. So Anansi sees that, and they said, "I can make more rain than that." So he goes out into the woods and grabs these 2 big branches, he sneaks up behind the dwarf, and smacks him so hard he kills him. So Anansi goes, "Uh-oh, this is the king's favorite dwarf. What are we going to do now?" So he throws the body up into a tree, and then calls his son over and says, "Oh, son, could you grab that piece of fruit from me hanging over there?" So the son scampers up the tree to get the fruit, and the body of the dwarf falls out. And Anansi cries, "Oh no, you killed the king's favorite dwarf." Now he'll be really angry. Now his son is no dummy. He's grown up with his father, so he knows all of Anansi's tricks. And he says, "Oh, thank goodness, I just heard the king was very angry with him. He'll probably reward me for killing his dwarf." And so at the sound of the word reward, Anansi's ears immediately perked up. And so he grabbed the dwarf's body, ran running back to the palace, and said, "Your Majesty, I killed your dwarf for you." Needless to say, the king was not angry at his dwarf. He was now angry at Anansi. He was extremely angry. So he put the dwarf's body into a wooden coffin and put it on Anansi's shoulders and said that from now on, you must carry the burden of this coffin everywhere you go. So Anansi went out there trudging with this wooden box on his shoulders, and he handled that well for about 5 minutes, maybe, you know. And so as he's walking along, he sees an ant going along. And he says, "Oh, ant, I have to run to the market to get something. Would you hold this box for me while I'm gone?" And the ant, who was very, very small and not very bright, said, "Oh, sure, Anansi." And so he sits the box on top of the ant, balances it very carefully, and then races off and never sees the ant again. But that is why to this day you often see ants running along carrying something really huge over themselves. See?
I do.
It all makes sense.
Clearly.
That's very typical of Anansi, who does nothing but terrible people and commits terrible crimes and never really gets punished.
I'm just stuck on the fact that he was willing to sell out his own son.
Yeah. That's, yeah.
I'm still in that portion.
That's Anansi for you.
Of the story.
Oh, he does worse things than that. There's now Anansi's arch enemy is Tiger, and I found at least a dozen stories without even trying where he outwits Tiger.
Is Tiger in fact a tiger?
Well, maybe. The peculiar thing about this is, and this kind of bothered me, and I tried to look it up and I couldn't find any legit answer without doing a lot more research. You may be aware that there are no tigers in Africa.
Okay.
They have lions, they have leopards, they have cheetahs, they don't have tigers.
Mm-hmm.
And yet somehow, when these stories are translated, it's always Anansi and the tiger. Apart from that one story about the leopard, I've yet to see a story that has Anansi and the lion, or Anansi and the cheetah. No, it's always the tiger, who was his arch enemy.
Is that there were never tigers, or did they become extinct?
It's been like 1 million years since there were tigers in Africa, experts say. So, I don't know.
Okay, so is tiger used in a different sense? Like, did it identify?
No, tiger is an anthropomorphic tiger, exactly like almost all the other animals. There's no difference between animals and people in these stories.
Right, but did the word tiger apply to a different animal?
And it's one animal in particular, but it's also all animals.
Oh, okay.
One of the tiger stories is Anansi's grandmother dies. So he's very upset about this, but also thinks there may be a way he can use this to his advantage. So he takes his grandmother's body and puts it in a wheelbarrow, and he's pushing her along. He goes into town, and he puts the wheelbarrow down and goes into a bar to get a drink. And he says to the guy behind the bar, "Oh, my Grammy's out there sleeping. You give this glass to her, and she'll really appreciate it." So the bartender goes outside and starts to shake her to wake her up a little bit, and she just flops over dead. So Anansi goes rushing out, "You killed my grandmother, you monster!" And so the guy behind the bar is horrified, of course. He says, No, calm down, be quiet. And so he finally gives Anansi a bag of gold to go away. So Anansi gratefully takes the bag of gold, leaves his dead grandmother at the bar, and goes rushing off to the jungle, counting the gold coins in his bag. So as he's going along counting his coins, he runs into Tiger, and Tiger says, "Where did you get all that gold?" And Anansi says, "Oh, it was easy. I went into town and I traded my dead grandmother for a bag of gold." So Tiger, not being very bright, goes back and kills his own grandmother and drags her into town and says, "Who will give me a bag of gold for my grandmother?" Well, the authorities did not take kindly to this, mind you. He was arrested and locked up. In this version, there are apparently judges and jails. Yeah. But Tiger got off easy in that one. Yeah.
I feel like I know some people who very much resemble Anansi's spirit.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, yeah. It's
I can think of a number of people.
Extremely self-centered. Sees everybody as someone he can use. He's always trying to, turn anything to his advantage. There's several different versions of how he takes away Tiger's manhood. I don't know if you want to hear those or not.
Let's Go for it.
They're not really fit for a general audience, but
Oh, maybe not then.
but basically, yeah, he's responsible for removing Tiger's manhood. However, he's able to shift the blame onto Monkey.
Okay, are we literally removing?
Well, no, because tigers still reproduce.
Okay.
But yes, he does this, and then he goes running through the jungle, singing a merry song about how he has tigers, you know. And the song is so infectious and catchy that monkeys hear it, and the monkeys start chanting it. So Tiger believes that Monkey is responsible for it, which is why tigers chase monkeys to this very day.
Ah.
So I see. So it has a happy ending, sort of.
Was there some kind of parallel in the Jungle Book?
Quite possibly. One of the stories that Neil Gaiman repeats in Anansi Boys is one in which Anansi in this one has a wife and a son, again, and they're living on a farm. And so his family has planted these like really great beans, and actually peas, I think it is. Anyway, they're delicious, and Anansi really wants them, but they don't want him to eat them all up.
Mm-hmm.
So he feigns being ill. He says that he's dying. And his wife, of course, mourns for him, and he makes her promise like two things before he goes: that he'll be buried out near the pea field where the plants have been planted, and that she'll always keep a fire burning by his graveside to remember him by. So of course, the grieving widow agrees to do this. So sure enough, he passes away. So the mother and the son go out, they bury him, they have a big funeral and so forth. They light a fire by his graveside. But sure enough, as soon as the sun goes down, he pops out of his grave, and he goes and gathers all the beans and sticks them into a big pot, puts them over the fire, boils them up, and spends the whole night eating them. And then dives back in and pulls the dirt over himself by the time the sun comes up. So he does this for quite a length of time until almost all the food in the garden is gone, and his wife and his son are basically starving. Although his son is not quite as slow in the uptake as, say, Tiger is. So the son begins to guess that something is going wrong here. So he takes a figurine made out of tar, and he sticks it in with the vegetables. And so that night, when Anansi climbs out of his grave, he sees another figure there. He's very angry that someone is intruding on his private spot here, so he gets into a fight with the tar figurine. And if you've heard this story before, you'll know that he gets completely stuck. All 8 legs get stuck in this tar, and he cannot get out. This version of the story technically ends with Anansi dying. Yeah, nobody rescues him, and he can't trick anyone into freeing him, so he actually dies in this version of the story. He comes back in the next story, like I said.
I don't like to speak ill of the dead. I don't like to speak ill of the dead, so I'll
He already
reserve
died,
my comments.
He died once in the story, technically. But the story of the tar baby, or the tar figurine, is one of those things that's been told and retold many times. And it's also associated with more than one trickster god. It's part of a whole cycle of stories. First of all, the Anansi stories, they have versions of them that are available for little kids. These are children's versions of Anansi stories, which do not involve Tiger and his precious bits.
Okay.
There are other cuter stories. In this one, Anansi tries to trick Turtle into catching fish for him, so he can eat fish for free. In fact, Turtle tricks him into weaving a net to catch the fish with. So Anansi winds up doing all the hard work, and in the end, Turtle steals the fish. However, once he knows what a net is, Anansi uses that to weave the first spider web. So he can still get food for free without having to work very much. This is where spiders make webs. Now, the spider was associated very closely with Adanko, who was the trickster hare. He lived from a slightly more eastern part of Africa. But their stories are very closely associated. You wouldn't think that a spider and a hare would have much in common, but they're both trickster gods, and some of the same stories are told about both of them. So the stories about the magic trickster hare, Adanko, became confused and conflated with the Anansi stories. And they too were brought over to the New World by slavery, which is where we get these kinds of stories. The Brer Rabbit stories, or Brer Rabbit, as Virginia Hamilton liked to call it. These are the stories that were popularized by Joel Chandler Harris and filmed in the Disney movie Song of the South that today no one is allowed to see.
Okay. So that is in fact Briar Rabbit.
Yes. As with all stories, there's many different variations on the tales. Briar is short for brother, and Virginia Hamilton chose to abbreviate it differently than Joel Chandler Harris did. Harris is a controversial figure. He both preserved an enormous amount of African American culture and stole it for himself and got really rich off of it. So that's a whole complicated another story. But stories are constantly changing. So there's several different versions of all of the Anansi stories. And then when you conflate him with the trickster rabbit stories, now when those came into America, there's also yet another cycle of trickster rabbit stories, and that's Manny Bozo of the Algonquin faith. Manny Bozo was the trickster god of the East Coast Indians. And some of his stories also got jumbled into the rabbit stories.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah. And even more interesting to me, at least, because I love silly trivia, there's an artist who illustrated the Uncle Remus stories for the publication in England named Beatrix Potter. And she would go on to write a whole cycle of stories about another trickster rabbit known as Peter Rabbit. So Peter Rabbit in England, sort of the genteel countrified rabbit, is just another retelling of the Brer Rabbit stories, which are retellings of the Adanko the Hare stories, which all come from Anansi the trickster spider.
Makes you wonder what's going on with the rabbits. Like, I don't hear this about salamanders.
Rabbits are extremely tricksy. I could vouch for that. Want to hear a true story?
Let's hear it.
Absolutely true. Okay, this takes place a long time ago in a land known as Virginia. When I was in high school, I had a cat in those days named Loki.
A cat.
A cat.
Okay.
An actual cat, didn't talk or anything that I knew of. So he's both an indoor and an outdoor cat because we live like really near the woods. All right, so I'm in the backyard one day and I see Loki playing and romping, and suddenly I see him tearing across the yard as fast as he can. And I realize he's chasing a baby rabbit. A tiny little baby rabbit running across the yard, and Loki was chasing him. And now I accept the fact that a cat is a predator. It is his nature to hunt and kill, and I understand that, and I totally respect Loki's desire to do this. I still didn't want to see it happen. So what happened actually was the rabbit dove into a big bush, and Loki immediately tore around the other side of the bush, and there was no rabbit. So from my point of view, I could see the rabbit had wriggled around inside the bush and ran back out the exact way that he came in, directly along his own trail. So eventually Loki circles the entire bush around and around and around, and he cannot find this rabbit anywhere. So he wanders over to me, he looks up at me, and he says, "Meow." And I'm like, "No, I am not going to help you catch a baby rabbit. I'm sorry. If you had caught him, I would have accepted that. But I am not going to help you with this." So that kind of annoyed at me and went away. That's exactly how it works in real life. True story.
That was very slick. And for a baby.
For a baby rabbit, yeah.
Yeah.
I did not expect that much cleverness from the rabbit.
That's impressive.
Yeah. So there's no wonder those tails get attached to rabbits. Spiders, on the other hand, I'm not as sure about. And how you conflate rabbits and spiders together is a whole nother mythological kettle of fish.
Well, thank goodness for conversations. We'll track it down.
Yeah. Anansi has all the bad qualities of a trickster god and almost none of the good qualities. And Anansi Boys by Neil Gaiman shows exactly how awful it is to have a companion who doesn't feel guilty about anything, has no conscience whatsoever, and has superpowers.
Yep, those are rough times right there.
Absolutely rough times indeed. So yes, Anansi is very popular, very famous all around the world. There's tons of Anansi stories. And we'll continue with more stories next week. Are you happy with this?
I am. Well, I'm just disturbed.
Why?
Again, he just threw his son under the bus, and
Yeah.
you said that wasn't the worst of it.
No, I think when he starved his son to death by eating all the food in the fields. His wife and his son, he starved them to death. Yeah.
Right, yeah.
That was what I was thinking was
So-
even worse. Yeah, he has no conscience whatsoever. And he's rarely punished for his crimes.
It's difficult for me to navigate that. But definitely intriguing.
Yeah. Yeah, he's not nearly as likable or as fun-loving as the Monkey King. He's not as sly as Coyote. One thing I noticed reading a bunch of Anansi stories all in a row is that he's only successful because the other animals are much more stupid than he is.
And there's never a turnabout for him.
No, there's almost never a turnabout. No matter how many times he pulls these stunts, Tiger always falls for it. Like a dozen different stories, he never catches on.
But even just internally.
Yeah.
There's...
No. It may also point to the nature of how nature works. The nature doesn't care what happens to you.
I suppose.
Could be. You can tell about a people by the gods that they worship. And while Anansi is part of a larger pantheon, which I'm not going to get into, but he's become more famous in all of them. Some say it's because people just love trickster stories, but also all stories are Anansi stories. I even saw one storyteller who said that Anansi always comes out looking really good by the end of the story because ultimately, well, it's his story. We can't help it when you tell an Anansi story. You always kind of grudgingly like him at the end.
Well, we're not there yet.
You're not there. Okay, it takes a while. It'll take a few Anansi stories before you see his charms.
Maybe I know him too well. That could be.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It's Yeah, I shared an apartment with a roommate who was a junkie. So the idea of being incredibly self-centered, looking at the world as, a way of lining your pockets, is a lot of human beings have that exact same attitude. All right, well, on that kind of dour note.
It is what it is.
Yes. Until next time, I've been Ed.
Solitaire.
We'll see you next time on Conversations. Till then, be safe.